So we saw with departmental overhead rates a way of refining the allocation of overhead to make it even more accurate. And activity-based costing is even more involved and results in a greater degree of accuracy, because instead of just looking at the department usage, it looks at all of the activities that are involved in making a product or performing a service. And so we're going to break down all of the activities. So it involves a study where you look at every step involved in your product. And so here's an example where they've broken down the manufacturing activities to machine setup, then materials handling, bringing the materials down to the floor to start working on it, fabricating the parts, the actual manufacturing. Someone needs to be supervising, and then inspecting, and then packaging. So we can look at all of these activities and we can see the costs involved with every activity. And then we're going to calculate an activity rate. And we're going to allocate the overhead kind of the same way we did using the overhead rate, the plant-wide overhead rate, or the department rate. But here it's broken down into smaller pieces, and so we do have a greater degree of activity. So here are the steps to using activity-based costing. So when you want to implement activity-based costing, you'll have to do a study and look at all of your processes. And so identifying the activities is the first step, and this is very costly. And then you'll have to estimate the overhead cost for each activity. And then you select an allocation base. So we were just looking at allocation bases of direct labor hours and machine hours, but now, since we've broken it down by activity, we can choose an allocation base that's going to more closely correlate with the way the costs are being incurred. And then we compute an allocation rate for each activity. So all of these steps, steps 1 through 4, that would be done before the start of the period, just how when we talked about with the predetermined overhead rate, the overhead rate was determined before the start of the period, and then that was the rate you used during the period to allocate overhead. So same here, we have all these steps that will take place before the period even starts. And then step 5 occurs during the period. That's when we actually allocate the overhead using these individual activity rates. So step 1, identifying the activities. We saw that example where there was, I don't know, about 5 or 6 activities. You can get as detailed as you need. I mean, you could have hundreds of activities, but then you have to think about what makes sense. Does it make sense to allocate costs and have activity rates for hundreds of activities, or should we group some of these activities together, right? We always operate with the cost-benefit rule. The benefit of the effort you're putting, the benefit of the results need to justify the cost of the effort that you're putting in. So here's their example. For machine setup, these are the costs that related indirect labor used to set up the machines, and then they estimated the cost of it. Materials handling, the forklifts, the gas, the operating wages. Here's the estimated costs. So you go through all of the activities, you decide what's included in that activity, and then you're going to estimate the total cost that you're going to be incurring during the period for the activity. So that's the very important first step, and this is very costly to implement activity-based costing because this study is going to take a lot of effort. Then we need to select an allocation base for each activity. So allocation base and cost driver, those terms are used interchangeably. So this is where you can come up with a different type of allocation base other than just direct labor hours or machine hours, and that allocation base is going to be more indicative of how the costs are being consumed. So for example, For purchasing, we said the number of purchase orders. So we're going to take the total cost of purchasing and divide it up by the number of purchase orders. That's going to be our activity rate. Materials handling, how many parts needed to be moved, right? Production scheduling, how many batches? Inspections, the number of inspections. Okay, so you can see it kind of makes sense how they're determining these allocation bases. And then we can compute the allocation rate for the activity. So we take the estimated activity cost pool, so the total estimated costs for that activity, and divide it by that specific allocation base. So then we have an allocation rate for the activity. And then during the period, then we can use those activity rates to allocate the overhead. So for every activity, we're going to take that activity rate, we'll multiply it by the actual number of the allocation base, right? So for purchasing, we take the purchasing allocation rate, multiply it by the number of purchase orders used for a job. For materials handling, we'll take the materials handling activity rate, multiply that by the number of parts used for the job. So then we'll have for every single activity, we will have the amount of overhead being allocated for that activity, and then we'll add up the overhead allocated for each activity, and that'll give you the total manufacturing overhead allocated for the job. I want to go through an example of how activity-based costing works. So here's an example of a company that manufactures two types of handbags, standard and custom. And they'd been using the plant-wide overhead rate, and they wanted to see what would happen if they were to use activity-based costing. So they identified two activity pools, machining and machine setup. And here they've given you the standard information and the custom information. They've estimated overhead costs are $300,000 and overhead costs allocated to machining. So this $300,000 of overhead, when they break it down, $200 is machining and $100 is machine setup. So first off, they ask us in the requirement to compute the overhead rate using the traditional approach. So the traditional approach is using the plant-wide rate, a single overhead rate. So this is traditional. So under the traditional, we would get a single rate by taking the total estimated overhead, which they told us is $300,000, and we would divide that by, here the information up above tells us that the plant-wide rate was based on direct labor hours. So for direct labor hours, they said 200,000 was for standard, 2,000 was standard, 4,000 was custom. So we've got 6,000 direct labor hours. So we can divide then the total estimated cost divided by the direct labor hours. So it would be $50 per direct labor hour. And so using that, standard's overhead, standard used 2,000 direct labor hours. So the overhead for standard would be the 2,000 times the $50 rate, right? It's $50 per hour, and we use 2,000 direct labor hours. So 100,000 is the overhead allocated to standard. For custom, again, we would take, it's a $50 per direct labor hour, and custom used 4,000 direct labor hours, so 200,000 would be allocated to custom. So that's how the estimated 300,000 of overhead would be allocated. 100,000 to standard, 200,000 would be allocated to custom. Now let's take a look at the overhead using activity-based costing. So under activity-based costing, for machining, it would probably make more sense to use the machine hours as an allocation base. So for machining, we would take the activity cost pool, and they're saying the machining activity cost pool is 200,000. And we're going to divide that by the allocation base, and it would make more sense to use machine hours. Well, our total machine hours is going to be 1,000 that standard uses and 1,000 that custom uses. So we're going to have 2,000 machine hours. So it would make sense to take the 200,000 and divide that by the 200, and so it would be 100 per machine hour. And then for machine setup, our other activity, and again, this is a pretty simple example, we've only got 2 activities, but for machine setup, they're saying 100,000 is allocated to the machine setup activity, and it would make sense to use the setup hours as the allocation base. So 100 setup hours for standard, 400 for custom. Our total setup hours are going to be 500. So when we divide the total estimated cost pool for machine setup by the allocation base of setup hours, we get $200 per setup hour. And so that's what we're going to use to allocate the overhead using activity-based costing. So for standard, let me make a column here for standard. Right? We would have the machining activity and the machine setup activity. And so for machining, to get the machining overhead, it's $100 per machine hour, and the standard product is going to use 1,000 machine hours. So we're going to multiply the $100 rate times the 1,000 machine hours. For machine setup for standard, we'll take the 200 activity rate is 200 per setup hour, and we'll multiply it by the 100 setup hours that the standard product will use. So the allocated overhead for standard is going to be 120. 100 for machining plus 20,000 for machine setup. And we'll do the same thing for custom. To get the machining overhead, we'll take the overhead rate for machining, it's $100 per machine hour, and we'll multiply that by the machine hours used for custom. So that was also 1,000. For machine setup, we'll take the $200 per setup hour activity rate for machine setup and multiply that by the 400 setup hours for custom. So that comes to 80,000. So our total overhead allocated to custom should be 180 under activity-based costing. So we can see, using the traditional method, the single plant-wide rate, standard was only getting 100,000 allocated to it, and then when we look more closely, using activity-based costing, which is going to be more accurate, it really should be allocated 120,000 of overhead. So we can see the standard product had been undercosted. The custom product, we can see, should have 180,000 allocated to it, and under the traditional method, it was overcosted. 200,000 was being allocated. So this is what we mean by cost distortion. It turned out that the custom product line was picking up some of the overhead being incurred by the standard product line. And so this is what makes activity-based costing so valuable, and why you will be willing to incur those costs of implementing it to get the accurate information.